And we're going to dive straight into the second question, Nick, with you. This one is from Susan. It was in Afrikaans, but for the sake of our viewers, we put it in English. So we're going to move ahead with English, Susan. So basically, this has to do with a lease agreement. And basically here, the question that it has is that in the lease agreement, there's a clause, and the question is this clause legal, right? The clause is put in this way, that the tenant will be responsible for maintenance in the premises, right? With the agreement that there will be no yearly increase on the rent. So you manage, you maintain the premises, and then in return, per agreement, there will be no increase. There will be no yearly increase in the rent. Is that legal?
Okay. So let's just briefly go over legal clauses within agreements as a broad perspective first. So, within South African law, parties are for the most part entitled to contract with one another in whatever way they want. Okay, our law doesn't, generally doesn't try and influence the contracts that people enter into with one another. The only difference is when legislation kicks in, okay? And in certain transactions, legislation kicks in and makes sure that there aren't, unfair terms or anything like that, which parties are contracting with one another, okay? And then obviously parties cannot contract contra to legislation or out of legislation, okay? In terms of rentals, there's obviously the Rental Housing Act, which does, in fact, provide some guidance with regards to what kind of agreements and what are the terms of those agreements that parties can legally agree to. Okay, and so you've got to stay within the ambit of a particular act, so that there's nothing that falls outside, because anything that falls outside is going to be illegal and can be set aside in the circumstances. Okay, now, when it comes to this particular clause, this is maintenance, which is something that's very common dealt with in lease agreements, and also increases in rental. Okay. Now, the interesting part about this question is, in terms of a rental, if you decide to enter into a rental or you are renting from a landlord, it is not an automatically assumed thing that rental is going to increase on a year-to-year basis. Okay, that has to be something that's specifically agreed between the parties, and you'll find any of your well-drafted lease agreements, they're going to contain a clause that specifically relates to yearly increases of rental, or just a throwaway clause that basically says the rental will increase if this lease agreement continues on an annual basis at whatever percentage. Okay, if that clause isn't in the lease agreement, your rental doesn't increase. It stays at whatever your rental amount is indicated in terms of your lease agreement. Okay, so that is an example of a term that is allowable, and you can absolutely contract on how the rental is going to be dealt with. Does it increase on a yearly basis? Obviously, we all know that it's very common practice that this is going to increase on a yearly basis. Okay, the other part of this is obviously the maintenance portion. Okay, and this obviously we know. The question here that's been asked is maintenance in the premises. So I'm going to keep it within the ambit of maintenance in the premises. That maintenance portion is for the tenant's account in any event, because they're the ones who are inside the premises during the subsistence of the lease agreement. They are the ones who need to make sure that everything is still working and is relatively fair wear and tear accepted in the condition in which it was let to them. And obviously, this has the consequence of when the premises is handed back at the end of the lease term, the landlord is entitled to expect it in the condition that it was let in to them, fair wear and tear accepted. Alternatively, if there's some other agreements in the lease agreement, sometimes it's agreed that it'll be white boxed or whatever the case is. It's more of a commercial transaction, but it can be agreed to that there's going to be a different proportion. But for the most part, you've got to hand in your premises back in the condition in which you received it. All right. So specifically with regards to this particular question, is it allowable to agree that the tenant will maintain the inside of the property, and then the remuneration for that is basically you won't have to do increases in rent on an annual basis? Yes, you could absolutely agree to that. I don't see anything that's contrary to public policy, contra bonus mores, for an agreement like that between the parties to be reached. It's a good deal for the tenants in the circumstances, depending on how much maintenance that property is going to take. But, to agree that you won't have annual increases in rental, I mean, if I was the tenants, I'd jump right on.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely agree.
Okay, well, yeah, so there you have it. Thank you, Susan, for the question. And therein lies the answer. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Yeah, and I think that about does it for today's questions, guys.
Cool. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Yes.
I'll see you next week.
Yeah.